In the bustling town of Thornwick, where cobblestone streets wound between timber-framed buildings and the marketplace hummed with daily commerce, there lived two men whose paths were destined to cross in the most peculiar way. The first was Thomas Whitmore, known throughout the region as Thomas the Peculiar, or sometimes the Wise Fool. He was a man of perhaps 40 years with wild gray hair that stood at odd angles, mismatched clothing that seemed assembled in complete darkness, and a habit of talking to pigeons as though they were his financial advisors. The townspeople laughed at Thomas, pointing fingers when he walked through the square wearing one boot and one slipper, or when he argued loudly with his own shadow. Children would follow him, mimicking his stumbling gait and absent-minded mumblings. Yet those who truly knew Thomas understood that beneath his foolish exterior lay a mind sharp as Damascus steel and eyes that missed nothing. The second man was Victor Blackwood, a merchant who claimed to own extensive warehouses in 3 different cities, ships that sailed to exotic lands, and trading connections with royalty across the sea. Victor was tall and imposing, with slicked-back dark hair, a precisely trimmed beard, and expensive clothing that announced his supposed wealth. He wore rings on 6 fingers, carried a gold-topped walking cane, and spoke with the confident boom of a man accustomed to being obeyed. There was only one problem. Victor Blackwood owned absolutely nothing. No warehouse, no shop, no ships, no connections. He was a phantom merchant, a professional liar who had perfected the art of deception. Victor's schemes were elaborate and carefully constructed. He would arrive in a town like Thornwick and immediately rent the finest room at the best inn, paying for a week in advance with coins he'd swindled from his previous location. He would then spend days at the tavern, buying rounds of drinks and telling elaborate stories of his trading empire. He described silk from the Orient, spices from the Indies, and jewels from African mines. He would casually mention that he was in town to establish a new trading post, implying enormous wealth and opportunity. Once Victor had established his false reputation, the real deception would begin. He would approach wealthy merchants and landowners with exclusive investment opportunities. "My ship arrives in 3 weeks," he would say with absolute conviction, "carrying goods worth 20 times what I'm asking for partnership shares. But I need capital now to pay the harbor fees and customs duties. Invest just 100 gold crowns and I'll return 300 when the ship docks." The beauty of Victor's scheme was its simplicity. He would collect money from multiple investors, all believing they were getting exclusive access to his profitable ventures. He would provide elaborate fake documents, complete with official-looking seals he'd purchased from a forger in the capital. He would even stage events to prove his legitimacy, hiring actors to pretend to be his ship captains or warehouse managers, renting temporary office space for a single day to show investors his headquarters, or arranging for accomplices to deliver fake letters confirming imaginary deals. When Thomas first encountered Victor, it was at the Golden Lion Tavern on a rainy Tuesday evening. Thomas had shuffled in, apparently confused whether the tavern was a library, and was loudly asking the bartender where the history section was located. The patrons roared at laughter. Victor, sitting at the best table near the fireplace, barely glanced at the fool, dismissing him as beneath notice. But Thomas had noticed Victor immediately. In his seemingly wandering observation, Thomas had cataloged everything. The expensive clothes that were slightly too perfect, the practiced gestures, the way Victor's stories changed small details each time he told them, and most importantly, the cold calculation in Victor's eyes when he thought no one was watching. Over the following week, Victor's scheme unfolded exactly as he planned. He convinced Margaret Ashford, the wealthy widow who owned the textile mill, to invest 200 gold crowns in his spice trading venture. He persuaded Richard Coppersmith, who had just inherited his father's successful forge, to put up 150 crowns for shares in a shipment of rare metals. He even convinced the town's mayor, Henry Blackhorn, to invest town funds into what he claimed was an opportunity to establish Thornwick as a regional trading hub. Thomas watched it all with his seemingly unfocused eyes. He was present, apparently by accident, at the tavern when Victor met with investors. He bumbled into the rented office space, claiming he thought it was a bakery, and stayed long enough to spot the fake seals and forged documents. He even accidentally followed one of Victor's accomplices back to a shabby boarding house on the wrong side of town, quite unlike the wealthy associates a real merchant would employ. The townspeople continued to laugh at Thomas. When he tried to tell Margaret Ashford that something seemed wrong about Victor's business, she patted his head like a child and gave him a copper penny for sweets. When he mentioned to the blacksmith that he'd never seen any actual goods from Victor's supposed warehouses, the blacksmith told him to stop bothering his betters and go count clouds or whatever fools did with their time. But Thomas was not discouraged. He had faced such dismissal his entire life. His strategy was subtle and long practiced. He began to play an even more exaggerated version of the fool around Victor. He would stumble near the merchant's table, spilling drinks, asking ridiculous questions, and generally making himself seem like the most harmless, brainless creature in all of Thornwick. "Excuse me, Mr. Important Merchant, sir," Thomas said one evening, tugging at Victor's expensive sleeve with dirty fingers. "I have a question about business." Victor looked at him with barely concealed disgust. "What is it, fool?" "If I have 3 chickens and I trade 2 chickens for a goat, but the goat eats my hat, do I still have chickens?" Thomas asked with complete seriousness. The town exploded with laughter. Victor forced a smile and pushed Thomas away. "No, you don't. Now leave me be." But in that brief interaction, Thomas had accomplished his goal. He had touched Victor's sleeve and confirmed what his eyes had told him. The expensive fabric was quality, but it was rented, not owned. There was a small tag still inside the cuff, the kind rental shops used. Furthermore, Thomas had been close enough to see the documents Victor was showing a potential investor, and he'd memorized the seal design and signature. Thomas shuffled away, apparently distracted by a moth near the ceiling, but his mind was racing. He now had confirmation of his suspicions, but he needed proof that others would believe. That was always the challenge for Thomas. Being right meant nothing if no one would listen. The next morning, Thomas appeared at the town registrar's office. The town registrar, Edmund Thornberry, was a thin, nervous man with spectacles that perpetually slipped down his nose. He looked up from his ledgers with barely concealed annoyance when Thomas stumbled through the door, apparently chasing a butterfly that existed only in his imagination. "Thomas, please," Edmund sighed, pushing his spectacles up. "I'm very busy today. The mayor needs records for—" "Butterflies keep secrets in their wings," Thomas announced loudly, spinning in a circle. "Do you keep secrets in your books, Mr. Edmund?" "What? No, these are public records, Thomas. Now please." "Public records! Yes, yes," Thomas clapped his hands. "I need to see the public records about ships that come to Millhaven Port." Millhaven was the nearest coastal town about 20 miles from Thornwick, where any legitimate merchant would dock their vessels. Edmund was about to refuse, but the law was clear. Public records were indeed public. With a heavy sigh, he retrieved the harbor master's reports that were filed monthly with all inland towns for tax purposes. "Here, look all you want, but don't damage anything." Thomas spent the next 3 hours appearing to randomly flip through pages, occasionally reading passages aloud in funny voices, and generally behaving like someone who had no idea what he was looking at. But his eyes were scanning every entry with precise attention. He found exactly what he expected. No ship registered to Victor Blackwood, no cargo claims, no customs payments, no warehouse receipts. Nothing at all. But the absence of evidence wasn't enough. Thomas needed positive proof of deception. He carefully noted the names of actual merchants who did have legitimate shipping records, then continued his apparent foolishness until Edmund practically begged him to leave. That afternoon, Victor Blackwood held court at the Golden Lion, describing in vivid detail the magnificent ship that would arrive in exactly 2 weeks. The Sapphire Wind, he called it. 3 masts, crew of 40, carrying goods worth over 10,000 gold crowns. Thomas was there, sitting in the corner, apparently trying to teach a mouse to dance, but he was listening to every word. I've sailed on her myself, Victor continued, warming to his story. From the port of Alexandria to the spice markets of Kerala. She's the finest vessel on the northern trade routes. What's she carrying this time? Asked Robert Merriweather, the town's prosperous grain merchant, already mentally calculating his potential profits. Saffron, cinnamon, silk, ivory carvings, and a special shipment of rare books for the cathedral in the capital, Victor replied smoothly. I'm only offering shares to a select few. This isn't the kind of opportunity that comes along often. Thomas suddenly jumped up, pointing at the window. Purple rain! It's going to rain purple! Everyone laughed as Thomas ran outside, staring at the perfectly normal sky. But once outside, Thomas's expression changed entirely. His eyes became focused and sharp. He walked with purpose to the stable where he kept his old donkey, Socrates. Despite his apparent poverty, Thomas actually had modest savings carefully hidden, earned from odd jobs and small rewards for finding lost items, a skill that came from his extraordinary observation. He saddled Socrates and began the journey to Millhaven. He needed to visit the port himself. The journey took most of the evening and into the night. Thomas arrived at Millhaven just after dawn, looking every bit the country fool on his tired donkey. The port was already bustling with activity. Fishermen were returning with night catches, merchant ships were being loaded and unloaded, and the harbor master's office was coordinating the organized chaos. Thomas approached the harbor master's office with his typical stumbling gait. The harbor master, a gruff woman named Captain Sarah Blackthorne, looked up from her clipboard. "Help you?" she asked shortly. "Oh, yes," Thomas said, bouncing on his feet. "I'm looking for a ship, a beautiful ship, the Sapphire Wind. Do you know her?" Sarah's expression didn't change. "Never heard of her. Who's the captain?" "Mr. Victor Blackwood, very important merchant, very rich, has many ships." Sarah set down her clipboard and walked to a large registry book. She flipped through it with the ease of long practice. "No Blackwood registered here, no ship by that name either. Is this some kind of joke?" Thomas let his face fall into exaggerated sadness. But he told everyone. He allowed tears to well up in his eyes. "He took my sister's money, her inheritance, 200 crowns for investment in the ship." This changed everything. Sarah's expression hardened. "Sit down and tell me everything." Thomas, still playing the simple fool, but now a distressed one, told her about Victor. Sarah listened carefully, then called for her assistant. "Bring me the fraud reports from the coastal towns." What arrived was a folder Thomas had desperately hoped to see. Inside were warnings from 3 other port cities about a con man matching Victor's exact description. He'd used different names: Vincent Darkwood in Northport, Victor Blackstone in Seahaven, and Valentine Blackmore in Westport. But the description was identical, and so was the scheme. Fake merchant, fake ships, false investments. He'd swindled over 30 people in the past year alone. "We've been looking for this man," Sarah said grimly, "but he moves quickly, and by the time victims realize they've been cheated, he's long gone." She looked at Thomas with new respect. "Your sister was smart to send you here to check. Most people just trust and wait until it's too late." Thomas ducked his head. "I'm not smart. Everyone says I'm a fool. But I remember things, and things didn't feel right." Sarah wrote out an official statement confirming that no such ship or merchant was registered at Millhaven, and no cargo was expected for any Victor Blackwood. She stamped it with her official seal. "Take this to your town magistrate. It should be enough to have him arrested for fraud." Thomas accepted the document carefully, but his mind was already racing ahead. He knew that simply having Victor arrested wasn't enough.
The con man would talk his way out, claim it was all a misunderstanding, or his accomplices would help him escape before trial. He'd seen it happen before with other criminals. The legal system in these times was slow and easily corrupted by a silver-tongued deceiver. No, Thomas needed something more. He needed Victor to expose himself so thoroughly that there could be no escape, no smooth talking, no wiggling out of consequences. And he needed the townspeople who had mocked and dismissed him to see the truth with their own eyes. As Thomas rode Socrates back towards Thornwick, a plan began to form in his mind. It would require careful timing, a bit of theatricality, and the very foolishness that everyone believed was his true nature. He arrived back in Thornwick the next afternoon, deliberately looking exhausted and confused. He went straight to the Golden Lion, where Victor was, as expected, holding court with several new potential investors. Thomas burst in, covered in road dust, and rushed directly to Victor's table. "Mr. Merchant, Mr. Merchant, I went to see your ship." The tavern went quiet. Victor's face remained calm, but Thomas saw the slight tightening around his eyes. "What nonsense are you babbling about, fool?" "Your ship, the Sapphire Wind. I wanted to see it. I walked all the way to the ocean. But I couldn't find the ocean. I walked and walked. Is the ocean hiding?" The tavern erupted in laughter. Even the people who'd invested with Victor were chuckling. Thomas was playing his role perfectly. Victor relaxed, smiling indulgently. "You walked to the ocean? Thomas, the ocean is 20 miles away at Millhaven. You can't walk there and back in a day." "But I did. I have fast feet," he insisted, doing a little dance. "And I met an angry boat lady. She said she never heard of Sapphire Wind. She said she never heard of you. But I told her she was wrong, because you're very important." Thomas continued his performance, pulling out the official document from inside his ragged coat, but holding it upside down as if trying to read it. "She gave me a paper with pretty stamps, but I can't read very good. What does it say, Mr. Merchant?" Victor's face had gone pale, but he maintained his composure. He reached for the document, but Thomas pulled it back, spinning away clumsily. No, I want Mr. Mayor to read it. He reads good. Where's Mr. Mayor?" "Thomas, give me that paper," Victor said, his voice hardening for the first time. He stood up, looming over the smaller man. But Thomas was already stumbling toward the door. "Mayor! Mayor! I need the mayor!" He rushed out into the street with half the tavern following to see what entertainment the fool would provide next. Victor remained frozen for just a moment, his mind calculating rapidly. Then he too walked out, keeping his expression calm and slightly amused, though his hand gripped his walking cane so tightly his knuckles were white. Thomas was making a scene in the town square, spinning in circles and calling for the mayor. A crowd was gathering, always ready for the fool's antics. Mayor Henry Blackthorne emerged from the town hall, looking irritated. "What is this commotion?" the mayor demanded. "I have a paper, an important paper, from the boat lady." Thomas thrust the document at the mayor, still holding it upside down. Mayor Blackthorne turned it right side up and began to read. His expression changed from annoyance to confusion to alarm. "This is an official statement from the Millhaven harbor master. It says—" He looked up at Victor, who had just arrived at the edge of the crowd. "It says there is no ship called Sapphire Wind registered at Millhaven. No merchant named Victor Blackwood has any cargo claims, warehouse receipts, or customs records." "There must be some mistake," Victor said smoothly, stepping forward with a confident smile. "Thomas is a confused fool. He probably went to the wrong port or spoke to the wrong person. My ships dock at multiple locations. The Sapphire Wind is currently registered out of Northport, not Millhaven." "Oh," Thomas clapped his hands. "Northport. I should go to Northport. Where's Northport?" "It's 80 miles north," the mayor said absently, still reading the document. "This also mentions fraud reports from multiple coastal towns about a con man using similar names." Victor's smile never wavered. Surely you're not suggesting that I, who has invested so much in establishing trade relations with Thornwick, am some common criminal. This is ridiculous. The fool went on a confused journey and got confused information. Margaret Ashford pushed through the crowd. Henry, I've invested 200 crowns with Victor. Are you saying I've been swindled? Of course not, dear Margaret, Victor said warmly. This is all a misunderstanding that I can clear up immediately. Mayor, I invite you to send an official inquiry to Northport. You'll find all my credentials are in perfect order. That will take weeks, protested Richard Coppersmith. The ship is supposed to arrive in less than 2 weeks. Thomas had been watching this exchange while apparently distracted by a dog nearby, trying to convince it to shake hands. But now he suddenly jumped up. I have an idea, a smart idea. Thomas doesn't have smart ideas, someone in the crowd laughed. No, listen, insisted Thomas. Mr. Merchant says his ship is at Northport. We send someone to Northport. Someone fast, on a fast horse. They ride there and check and come back. Then we know if Boat Lady is wrong or Mr. Merchant is wrong. Mayor Blackthorne nodded slowly. Actually, that's not a bad thought. Victor, surely you wouldn't object to us verifying your claims. If everything is as you say, this will only strengthen everyone's confidence in the investment. Victor's mind was racing. Northport was 80 miles, a 2-day hard ride there and back. He could be gone by then, but running would confirm guilt. However, he'd used the name Vincent Darkwood in Northport, and there were fraud reports there too. He needed to control this situation. Of course I don't object, Victor said with a magnanimous gesture, but sending someone all that way seems excessive based on the confused wanderings of the town fool. Instead, I propose this. I have business documents in my room at the inn, complete cargo manifests, registration papers, letters of credit from banking houses. Let me retrieve them, and we can settle this matter in minutes rather than days. Yes, papers! Thomas jumped up and down. I love papers. Can I see the papers? Do they have pictures? Thomas, be quiet, the mayor said. Victor, please fetch your documents. We'll wait here. Victor nodded and walked toward the inn with measured, confident steps, though his mind was in turmoil. His forged documents were good, very good. They'd fooled dozens of towns and other places, but that harbor master's statement was official and specific. He needed to either discredit it or create enough confusion to cast doubt on everything. What Victor didn't know was that while he walked to the inn, Thomas had already set another part of his plan in motion. 3 days earlier, Thomas had sent a message to Northport through a traveling merchant he trusted, a man named Samuel, who had known Thomas since childhood and was one of the few who understood that the Fool Act was mostly performance. The message had asked Samuel to come to Thornwick with any information about fraudulent merchants operating in the coastal regions. As Victor entered the inn, a horse and rider came thundering into the square from the North Road. It was Samuel, dust-covered and exhausted, pulling his horse to a stop directly in front of the mayor. Mayor Blackthorne, Samuel called. I received an urgent message about a con man operating in Thornwick. Is he still here? The timing seemed coincidental to the crowd, but Thomas had calculated it perfectly based on when he sent the message and how long the round trip would take. He'd gambled that Victor would still be in town, and the gamble had paid off. Who are you? The mayor asked. Samuel Porter, merchant of Northport. I've been trading honestly for 20 years. I received word you might have a criminal here calling himself Victor Blackwood or something similar. He's in the inn right now, fetching documents to prove his legitimacy, Mayor Blackthorne said.
Samuel shook his head grimly. Then he's gathering his escape funds. In Northport, he called himself Vincent Darkwood, swindled 12 people out of over 1,000 crowns with the exact same scheme. Fake ships, false investments, forged documents. By the time we realized what happened, he'd vanished. The crowd murmured in alarm. Margaret Ashford looked faint. Richard Coppersmith's face was turning red with anger. Are you certain it's the same man? The mayor asked urgently. Thomas's message described him perfectly. Tall, dark hair, beard, expensive clothes, gold-topped cane, rings on 6 fingers. That's Vincent Darkwood exactly. At that moment, Victor emerged from the inn carrying a letter folder. He stopped when he saw the new arrival and the changed mood of the crowd. His eyes darted to the escape routes, calculating distances. Thomas, who had been sitting on the ground playing with pebbles, suddenly spoke in a voice quite different from his usual foolish tones. "Going somewhere, Vincent?" Everyone turned to stare at Thomas. Victor's face went through a rapid series of expressions before settling on indignant anger. "I don't know what scheme you're attempting here, fool, but—" "The scheme is yours and it's over," Thomas interrupted, standing up and brushing off his pants. His whole demeanor had changed. His posture was straight, his eyes focused and intelligent. "You're Vincent Darkwood of Northport, Victor Blackstone of Sea Haven, Valentine Blackmore of Westport, and probably a dozen other names in a dozen other towns. You have no ships, no warehouses, no goods, just forged papers and smooth words." The crowd was stunned into silence. This wasn't the Thomas they knew. Victor made his decision in an instant. He turned and ran, surprisingly fast for a man of his build. He sprinted toward the stables, clearly planning to steal a horse and flee. But Thomas had anticipated this too. He put 2 fingers in his mouth and let out a sharp whistle. From the stable emerged John Butcher, the blacksmith's apprentice, leading Victor's rented horse. Except it wasn't saddled, and John was holding the reins firmly. "Looking for your horse, sir?" John called out with a grin. "Thomas paid me 6 pence to unsaddle it this morning, said there might be trouble." Victor spun around looking for another escape route, but the crowd had closed in, led by Richard Coppersmith and several other strong men who'd realized they'd been swindled. "Seize him," Mayor Blackthorne commanded. Victor fought, but he was no match for multiple angry men who'd lost their savings. Within moments, he was pinned to the ground, his expensive coat torn and his carefully styled hair in disarray. "Check his folder," Thomas suggested calmly. The mayor opened the leather folder. Inside were indeed documents, but also something else. Stacks of gold crowns, at least 500 by quick estimate. The money Victor had already collected from his victims, ready to be carried away when he fled. "My investment," Margaret Ashford gasped, recognizing some coins she'd specially marked. "And mine," Richard Coppersmith pointed to gold pieces with distinctive scratches he'd noted. Mayor Blackthorne's face was grim. "Victor Blackwood, or whatever your real name is, I'm placing you under arrest for fraud, theft, and conspiracy. You'll be held in our jail until the circuit judge arrives." He turned to Thomas, his expression a mixture of shame and wonder. "Thomas, you're not actually a fool, are you?"
Thomas smiled gently, a sad wisdom in his eyes that the townspeople had never noticed before. "I'm whatever I need to be, Mayor Blackthorne. Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage of all." The crowd erupted in confused chatter. People who had mocked Thomas for years, who had laughed at his stumbling and dismissed his warnings, now stared at him as if seeing a stranger. Children who had thrown pebbles at him hid behind their mothers. The merchants who had shooed him away from their shops looked ashamed. Margaret Ashford stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "Thomas, you tried to warn me. I patted your head like you were a simpleton and gave you a penny. I'm so sorry." "You are not the first to dismiss me, Margaret, and you won't be the last," Thomas said kindly. "People see what they expect to see. I learned long ago that looking foolish keeps me safe and allows me to observe truths that others miss." Victor, still pinned on the ground, laughed bitterly. "Very clever, playing the fool. How long have you been acting?" Thomas crouched down to look Victor in the eyes. "Who says I'm acting now and wasn't acting then? Maybe I'm always acting. Or maybe I'm never acting. That's the beauty of it. Nobody ever really knows." The constable arrived with iron shackles, and Victor was hauled to his feet. As they locked the manacles around his wrists, he looked at Thomas with grudging respect. "You're wasted in this pathetic town, you know. With your talents, you could be wealthy beyond measure." "I have everything I need," Thomas replied. "Can you say the same?" Victor was dragged away toward the town jail, still protesting his innocence, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, trying his silver tongue one last time, but nobody was listening anymore. Samuel dismounted and clasped Thomas's hand warmly. "Your message was perfectly timed, old friend. I've been tracking this bastard for months. He destroyed lives in Northport. A widow lost her late husband's entire pension. A young couple lost their shop. An old man his retirement savings." "He won't destroy any more," Thomas said firmly. "The circuit judge will see he faces justice in every town he swindled." Mayor Blackthorne cleared his throat awkwardly. "Thomas, I owe you an enormous apology. We all do. You saved this town from disaster, and we've treated you abominably for years." Thomas turned to face the assembled crowd. His expression was unreadable. "Do you want to know why I play the fool, Mayor? Truly want to know?" The square had gone silent. Everyone leaned in to hear. "Because 12 years ago, I was like Victor in one way. I was arrogant. I was the youngest merchant in 3 counties, successful and wealthy. I trusted everyone because I thought I was clever enough to spot deception. Then I was swindled by a man I considered my friend. He took everything, my business, my savings, my reputation. When I tried to expose him, nobody believed me because he was charming and I was desperate. He painted me as a failed merchant trying to blame others for my own incompetence." The crowd listened, transfixed. This was a Thomas none of them had known existed. "I lost everything," Thomas continued. "My wife left me, ashamed to be associated with a failure. My friends abandoned me. I came to Thornwick with nothing but the clothes on my back and a head full of painful lessons. I realized that people trust appearances over truth. They believe confidence over accuracy. So I became someone nobody would ever see as a threat. A fool notices things, asks questions, goes places that would be suspicious for a clever man. Nobody guards their words around a fool. Nobody watches what they do. A fool is invisible." Margaret Ashford was crying openly now. "Thomas, we were so cruel to you." "You were human," Thomas said with a shrug. "We all make judgments based on appearances. I used that tendency to protect myself and, when necessary, to protect others. Do you know how many times I found lost items that were actually stolen? How many times I've warned people away from bad deals by seeming to accidentally reveal information? How many fires I've prevented by clumsily knocking over lanterns that were dangerously placed?" Robert Merriweather, the grain merchant, stepped forward. "Last year you stumbled into my warehouse and knocked over a stock of barrels. I shouted at you, called you a clumsy idiot. But those barrels, they were stocked wrong, weren't they? They would have collapsed on their own, probably when workers were nearby." Thomas nodded. "The weight distribution was unstable. I saw it, but knew you wouldn't listen to a fool's warning, so I made it happen when nobody could be hurt." More townspeople began speaking up, remembering incidents they dismissed as foolishness that now appeared in a new light. The accident that revealed a merchant's dishonest scales, the confusion that led to discovering a dangerous structural weakness in the bridge, the silly questions that exposed a traveling healer's fake medicines. "You've been protecting us all along," young Edmund from the registrar's office said quietly, "even while we mocked you." "Especially while you mocked me," Thomas replied, "because that meant nobody ever suspected." John Butcher, still holding the horse's reins, spoke up. "But Thomas, you paid me 6 pence to unsaddle the horse. That's a lot of money for a fool who begs for copper pennies. Where did you get it?" Thomas smiled mysteriously. "Another assumption people make, that a fool must be poor. I do odd jobs, find lost valuables and return them for small rewards, sometimes help people in ways they don't even realize, and find coins left accidentally in my path later. I live simply, need little, and save carefully. I'm not wealthy, but I'm not destitute either."
The mayor shook his head in amazement. "This is extraordinary. Thomas, the town owes you a great debt. We should hold a ceremony, give you a reward, publicly honor you for saving us from Victor's scheme." "No," Thomas said firmly. "No?" The mayor looked confused. "If you do that, my usefulness ends. Tomorrow I need to go back to being Thomas the Fool, the harmless simpleton who talks to pigeons and wears mismatched shoes, because there will be other Victor Blackwoods, other threats, other problems, and I can only help if nobody sees me as a threat." The crowd murmured in disappointment, but understanding dawned on many faces. Samuel put a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You're asking them to go back to mocking you? To pretending this never happened?" "Not pretending it never happened," Thomas corrected, "but not broadcasting it either. Those of you here today know the truth. That's enough. You'll treat me the same as always in public, laugh at my foolishness, dismiss my ramblings, maybe be a little kinder in private.
And when I stumble into your shops or ask my ridiculous questions, you'll pay attention to what I'm really saying, even if you don't acknowledge it openly. Margaret Ashford wiped her eyes. That seems terribly unfair to you, Thomas. Fair is getting justice for swindlers and protecting good people, Thomas replied. That's all I want. Mayor Blackthorne stepped closer, lowering his voice so only those nearby could hear. Thomas, I understand your reasoning, but I have an official duty. The town must at least return the money you spent on this investigation. Your journey to Millhaven, the message to Northport, paying John here. Let me reimburse you from the town treasury. Thomas considered this. Very well, but give it to me in copper pennies, publicly, as a reward for helping the town. Fools get small rewards, not large ones. The mayor nodded. And privately, I want you to know that my door is always open to you. If you ever need anything at all, you come to me directly. Same here, said Robert Merriweather. My warehouses, my grain stores, whatever you need. My forge is yours, Richard Coppersmith added. Repairs, tools, horseshoes for Socrates, all free, forever. One by one, the townspeople Thomas had protected while they mocked him offered their services, their goods, their support. The baker promised fresh bread daily. The innkeeper offered free meals. The tailor said he'd make proper clothes. The cobbler pledged good boots. Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in 12 years. Acceptance. Not for being clever or successful, but for being exactly who he was. His eyes grew moist, though he blinked the tears away quickly. Thank you, he said simply, all of you. But please understand, I need to remain the fool. When I stumble into your shops, chase imaginary butterflies through your gardens, or ask if birds pay taxes, you must react as you always have. Laugh, dismiss me, shoo me away, because others will be watching. Strangers, travelers, people passing through. They need to see the town fool, not the town hero. We understand, Mayor Blackthorne said, but among ourselves, those of us here today, will remember. We'll watch for your signals, listen for your warnings, even when they sound like nonsense.
3 weeks passed, and life in Thornwick seemed to return to normal. Thomas resumed his role as the town fool, stumbling through the marketplace, having loud conversations with pigeons, and wearing one brown boot and one black boot. To outside observers, nothing had changed, but those who had witnessed Victor Blackwood's exposure saw Thomas with new eyes, even while maintaining the public charade. The circuit judge arrived on a cold autumn morning, and Victor's trial became the most attended event in Thornwick's recent history. The courtroom was packed with townspeople, and even more crowded outside, waiting for news. Samuel had brought witnesses from Northport, and Harbor Master Sarah Blackthorne had traveled from Millhaven with official documentation of Victor's fraudulent activities across multiple coastal towns. Thomas attended the trial dressed in his most mismatched clothing, sitting in the back corner, apparently more interested in drawing pictures in the dust on the floor than in the proceedings. But he missed nothing. Victor, even in chains, tried to maintain his dignity and charm. He'd hired a lawyer from the capital with the last of his hidden money, and the defense strategy was simple. Claim that all of this was a series of unfortunate misunderstandings, that he had indeed experienced business reversals that prevented his ships from arriving as promised, and that he had every intention of making his investors whole once his financial situation improved. My client is a victim of circumstances beyond his control, the lawyer argued smoothly. Storms delayed his ships, business partners proved unreliable, and yes, perhaps he was overly optimistic in his promises, but optimism is not a crime. Poor business judgment is not fraud. The prosecutor, a stern woman named Judith Hawthorne, stood to respond. The evidence shows a clear pattern of deliberate deception across multiple towns, using multiple false names. The defendant owned no ships, no warehouses, no goods. Every document he presented was forged. Every promise he made was a calculated lie designed to separate honest people from their hard-earned money. Victor's lawyer countered, "Where is the proof of intent? Perhaps my client believed these ventures would succeed. Perhaps he was himself deceived by others. Without proof of criminal intent, this is merely a civil matter of debts owed, not criminal fraud. It was a clever argument, and Thomas saw some jury members nodding thoughtfully. The law required proof of intentional deception, not just failed business ventures. Victor's smooth words and respectable appearance were working in his favor, even now. Thomas stood up abruptly, knocking over his bench with a loud crash. Everyone turned to stare. Excuse me, Thomas called out, waving his hand frantically. I have a question, a very important question. The judge, an elderly man named Cornelius Whitehall, frowned. Young man, this is not the time for... But I found something very important. Thomas was bouncing on his feet, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. Can I show, please, please? Judge Whitehall sighed. Bailiff, what is this person doing in my courtroom? Mayor Blackthorne stood quickly. Your Honor, this is Thomas Whitmore. He's the one who initially exposed the defendant's crimes. He's eccentric, but he may have relevant evidence. The judge gestured impatiently. Make it quick. Thomas shuffled forward, tripping over his own feet twice, and handed the crumbled paper to the judge. I found this in the trash behind the inn. I was looking for treasure in trash. People throw away good things sometimes, and I found this. Judge Whitehall smoothed out the paper. His eyebrows rose. This appears to be a letter to someone named Vincent, discussing the Thornwick job and how much money they expect to collect before moving to the next town. He looked at Victor sharply. The handwriting appears to match samples of your writing, Mr. Blackwood. Victor's face paled, but his lawyer quickly interjected. Anyone could have written that and planted this. This proves nothing about my client. Thomas scratched his head. Oh, there's more. I found a whole bunch of papers. I used some to wrap fish, but I still have... He began pulling more crumpled papers from various pockets. This one talks about fake seals from a forger in the capital. This one has a list of other towns to visit. This one says, remember to cry when talking about dead wife for sympathy. Each paper Thomas produced was more damning than the last. Victor's lawyer tried to object, claiming the evidence was improperly obtained, but Judge Whitehall silenced him. These were discarded in public trash, you say? The judge asked Thomas. Yes, public trash behind Public Inn. I find lots of things in trash. The judge nodded. Then they're admissible. Continue, Mr. Whitmore. The final paper Thomas produced was the most devastating. It was a detailed ledger in Victor's handwriting, listing every town he'd swindled, every false name he'd used, and exactly how much money he'd stolen from each location. The total was over 15,000 gold crowns. Why would he keep such records? Judith Hawthorne asked, though she looked delighted by the evidence. Thomas giggled. Bad people like to count their bad money. Makes them feel smart. Victor finally broke, standing up and shouting, That fool is lying. He planted those papers. He forged them. This is a conspiracy. So you deny this is your handwriting? Judge Whitehall asked calmly. No, Victor realized his mistake too late. The judge called for a handwriting expert who compared the papers to documents Victor had signed upon his arrest. After careful examination, the expert confirmed they were written by the same hand. The trial concluded swiftly after that. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with a guilty verdict on all charges: fraud, theft, forgery, and conspiracy to defraud. Judge Whitehall sentenced Victor Blackwood to 15 years of hard labor in the royal mines, followed by permanent banishment from the kingdom. As Victor was led away in chains, he locked eyes with Thomas one final time. You're the most dangerous man I've ever met, he said quietly, and nobody even knows it. Thomas gave him a lopsided, foolish grin. Knows what? I'm just lucky at finding things in trash. After the trial, the recovered money was distributed back to Victor's victims in Thornwick and the other towns. Many people had lost everything and wept with relief at getting their savings returned. Margaret Ashford donated her recovered funds to establish a shelter for those who'd been swindled by con artists, naming it the Whitmore House over Thomas's embarrassed objections. That evening, Mayor Blackthorne hosted a private dinner at his home for those who knew Thomas's secret. Samuel was there, along with Harbor Master Sarah, Margaret, Richard, Robert, and several others who had been present at Victor's capture. To Thomas, the mayor raised his glass, the wisest fool in all the realm. Everyone drank to the toast, but Thomas looked uncomfortable with the attention. Sarah Blackthorne studied him curiously. Thomas, I have to ask, those papers you produced at the trial, they seemed almost too perfect, too well-timed. Did you really find them in the trash? Thomas's eyes twinkled. I found them in Victor's room, actually, when I broke in 3 nights before the trial. The room went silent. Samuel started laughing first, then everyone joined in. You broke into his room? Margaret asked. Thomas, that's illegal. Only if I was there to steal or cause harm, Thomas replied with a shrug. I was there to gather evidence of crimes, and I didn't break anything. Victor had forgotten to lock his window.
I simply climbed in, found his secret ledger in a hidden pocket of his traveling bag, made copies of the most incriminating pages, and left everything exactly as I found it. Then I crumpled the copies and aged them to look like discarded trash. But what if he had discovered the window was unlocked? What if he had caught you? He'd been drinking heavily that night, mourning his failing scheme. I watched him pass out from the roof before I climbed in. And even if he had awoken, what would he have seen? The town fool, confused and lost, accidentally in the wrong room. I'd already prepared my excuse. I was looking for the privy and got confused in the dark. Judge Whitehall, who had been invited to the dinner after the trial, shook his head in amazement. Mr. Whitmore, what you did was technically illegal, but I find myself reluctantly impressed. Those documents sealed a conviction that might otherwise have been difficult to achieve. A clever lawyer could have created reasonable doubt without that evidence. That's why I gathered it, Thomas said simply. Justice matters more than perfect procedure. Victor destroyed lives. He needed to face consequences. Sarah leaned back in her chair. I've been doing this work for 20 years, and I've never met anyone quite like you, Thomas. Have you considered working officially with law enforcement? We could use someone with your skills. Thomas shook his head firmly. The moment I'm official, I'm visible. I'm expected. Criminals watch for investigators but ignore fools. My power comes from being underestimated. But don't you want recognition? Margaret pressed. Don't you want people to know how brilliant you are? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. 12 years ago, I had recognition. I had success and admiration. I also had arrogance and blindness. I was so confident in my own cleverness that I missed obvious warning signs. The man who swindled me succeeded because I thought I was too smart to be fooled. He looked around the table at the faces watching him. Being the fool taught me humility. It taught me to observe rather than assume. It taught me that wisdom isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about understanding people, seeing patterns, and knowing when to act and when to wait. But surely, after all you've accomplished, began.
What have I accomplished? Thomas interrupted gently. I helped catch one swindler. There are hundreds more out there. I prevented some harm in one small town. There's a whole kingdom full of people who need help. The work isn't finished. It never is. Mayor Blackthorne raised his glass again. Then here's to the continuing work of the wisest fool in Thornwick. May he stumble through our streets for many years to come, seeing what others miss, and protecting those who don't even know they need protecting. They all drank to that. As the dinner concluded and guests prepared to leave, Samuel pulled Thomas aside. I'm heading back to Northport tomorrow. Walk with me to the inn? They strolled through the quiet evening streets, passing shuttered shops and homes with candles glowing in windows. Socrates the donkey was tied outside the inn, and he brayed happily when he saw Thomas. I've been thinking, Samuel said carefully, about what you do here. It's remarkable. But Thomas, don't you ever get lonely? Don't you ever want real friendships where people know the real you? Thomas stroked Socrates' nose thoughtfully. I have real friendships. You, Mayor Blackthorne now, Margaret and the others who know the truth. That's more than I had in my old life where I had 100 acquaintances but no one who truly understood me. Fair enough, Samuel acknowledged. Just promise me something. If you ever need help, truly need it, you'll send word. Don't try to face everything alone. I promise, Thomas said, clasping his old friend's hand. After Samuel went inside, Thomas stood in the quiet street, looking up at the stars. Socrates nuzzled his shoulder companioningly. What do you think, old friend? Thomas murmured to the donkey. Did we do good work? Socrates snorted, which Thomas chose to interpret as agreement. From the shadows nearby, a voice spoke. Talking to animals again, fool? Thomas turned to see a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, watching him. She was dressed in traveling clothes and carried a pack, a stranger to Thornwick. Animals are good listeners, Thomas replied in his foolish voice, letting his posture slump into the familiar role. Better than people sometimes. Do you listen good? The woman studied him with sharp, intelligent eyes that reminded Thomas of someone, of himself perhaps, before he'd learned to hide his intelligence. I listen very well. I'm looking for a place to stay. I'm new in town. The Golden Lion is nice. Soft beds, good food. Sometimes they give me scraps. Thomas pointed helpfully at the inn. Thank you, the woman said, but she didn't move toward the inn. She was still watching Thomas with that unnervingly perceptive gaze. You're Thomas, aren't you? The fool who caught the merchant swindler? Thomas's heart rate increased slightly, but his expression remained innocent and confused. I helped. I found papers and trash.
I'm good at finding things. I'm sure you are, the woman said softly. Very good at finding things, and at seeing things others miss. She took a step closer. My name is Elizabeth, Elizabeth Whitmore. I'm your daughter. Thomas froze, all pretense falling away for a moment. He stared at the young woman, seeing features he recognized, his own nose, his late mother's eyes, the determined set of jaw that came from his father's side of the family. Clara was pregnant when she left, he whispered. She never told me. She didn't know until after she'd gone, she said, and by then pride kept her from reaching out. She told me about you, about the swindling, about how you lost everything. She painted you as a failure, a cautionary tale. She smiled sadly. But then I started hearing stories. Stories about a wise fool in Thornwick who helped people, who saw truth when others saw nothing. I wondered if it might be you, so I came to see for myself. Thomas didn't know what to say. 12 years of carefully maintained disguise, 12 years of loneliness and purpose, and now this, a daughter he'd never known existed, standing before him in the starlight. Your mother, he began, is she? She died 2 years ago, fever, Elizabeth said quietly. Before she passed, she admitted she'd been wrong to leave, wrong to judge you so harshly. She made me promise to find you, to tell you she was sorry. Thomas felt tears on his cheeks, the first he'd allowed himself in years. Socrates, sensing his distress, pressed close against him. Elizabeth stepped forward and embraced him, this father she'd never known existed, and Thomas, the wise fool of Thornwick, held his daughter and wept for all the lost years, for the wife who had left him, for the man he'd been and the man he'd become. Will you stay? He asked finally, his voice rough with emotion. For a while, Elizabeth said. I want to know you, the real you, not the fool or the failed merchant or the legend, just my father. Thomas pulled back, wiping his eyes, and gave her a genuine smile, not the fool's grin or the merchant's confidence, but something real and vulnerable. I'd like that very much, though I should warn you, the real me is probably somewhere between the fool and the legend, still figuring it out myself. Then we'll figure it out together, Elizabeth said. And so, as the stars wheeled overhead and Thornwick slept peacefully, protected by a guardian it barely acknowledged, Thomas began a new chapter of his strange and purposeful life. Tomorrow he would be the fool again, stumbling and silly and watching everything. But tonight he was simply a father, reunited with his daughter, finding that wisdom sometimes comes not from catching swindlers or protecting towns, but from accepting love when it finally finds you. The story of the wise fool and the lying merchant had ended, but Thomas's story continued, richer now, more complex, filled with new purpose and old hope renewed. And in the morning, when he walked through Thornwick streets in mismatched shoes, perhaps his foolish grin would be a little more genuine, his laughter a little more real, because he finally had what he'd lost 12 years ago, family, and with it, home.